How's your hammer, everybody? I'm PTDevil, and welcome to another episode of The Deck Doctors. In this series, we'll be looking at some of the most unplayable archetypes in the whole game, figuring out why they're so bad, and designing some new support to help make them playable. The process we'll be using is examining what it is they do, diagnosing what their problems are, and prescribing a treatment for them to be less awful. With all that said, let's get to the video. When you hear the term kawaii, odds are one of two things will cross your mind. Anime waifus or cute animal mascots. Now combine the two and you would almost assuredly have a marketing slam dunk no matter what medium it would be applied to. Unless, of course, we're talking about the most incompetent card game when it comes to archetype design, in which case we get charmers. To their credit, charmers have become a fan favorite among players and card designers alike, and it's fairly easy to see why. They're the whole package. No matter what your type is, they've got something for everyone. The feisty tomboy, the friendly girl next door, the shy and timid type, the bookish nerd, the pure-hearted angel, and of course, it's a trap! In addition to this, each of them is paired with a cute familiar to add to their visual appeal, so no matter what you're into, there's bound to be at least one of these cuties which will appeal to you. Which just makes it all the more infuriating that such a spot-on aesthetic design was met with an archetype design that's inconsistent at best and unplayable at worst. You guys all know the drill by now, so let's just get started. Considering the archetype's effect theming is this well ingrained in their design, we'll start with their first 6 monsters at once. Ita the Fire Charmer, Win the Wind Charmer, Area the Water Charmer, Asa the Earth Charmer, Dark the Dark Charmer, how specific? And Lina the Light Charmer are all level 3 spellcasters that cover the 6 main attributes of the game. They each have 500 attack and 1500 defense, and a flip effect where you can target and take control of one monster your opponent controls with a matching attribute for as long as you control the respective charmer. For the time of these cards' release, they were pretty decent for flip monsters, having a respectable 1500 defense to be able to maybe survive an opponent's attack, which is all the more handy in that it can then steal a monster from the opponent to be able to use for further plays. Or at least that was the intention. 1500 might have been a decent first turn wall back in the day, but even back then it was still a pretty easy bar to clear, to say nothing of how it stands up today. On top of that, the snatch only works for as long as said charmer remains on the field, so if it does get killed, the monster you steal will go straight back to the opponent and do nothing but waste yours and your opponent's time. Of course, that's assuming you are able to steal anything to begin with, because if your opponent doesn't happen to be controlling any monsters with a matching attribute to whatever charmer you happen to open up in your hand at any given time, this will do absolutely nothing for you. Furthermore, the fact that this effect is a flip effect means that you'll have to either devote additional resources to trigger it yourself, or pray that you have something that can protect it long enough for the opponent to trigger it themselves. That being said, these are still the monsters which the deck relies on the most, so you can't really do without them. As a general rule of thumb, I would try to max out on Asa, Dark, and Lina, and side out the ratios of the others according to your matchup and or the current format. I should mention for the sake of clarity that each of their familiars are monsters of their own, so I might as well cover them real quick. Foxfire, Petty Dragon, Gigobite, Archfiend Marmot of Nefariousness, okay, Metabat, and the Happy Lover are all mostly normal monsters under level 2 with variable type stats and attributes, none of which are particularly worth mention. The exception being Foxfire, who's an effect monster which can revive itself during the end phase if it was destroyed by battle while it was face up, but it cannot be tributed for a tribute summon. This can serve as a potential meat shield to block an attack or two, but considering that the effect doesn't work if you set it face down outside of the OCG, it's not nearly worth the effort and can't even be used as tribute fodder either. Why OCG only, I'll never know. Overall, none of these cards offer much of anything to the deck outside of acting as additional bodies of whichever attribute you need at the moment. However, since that's what you'll be using the opponent's monsters for more often than not, I wouldn't bother making room for these. And just so we're clear, Marmot's name was purely the TCG trying to be cute since its original name was just Demon Beaver. Why they decided to change a perfectly good name to something stupid like this, I'll never know, but I also don't want to know this time. The next few cards are related to the sub-archetype of Charmers known as the Familiar Possessed. In this case, they are Familiar Possessed Hita, Win, Aria, Asa, Dark, and Lina, who are all level 4 spellcasters with 1850 attack and 1500 defense, who can be special summoned from your hand or deck by sending their base forms along with another monster of the same attribute to the graveyard. If they're summoned this way, they gain piercing battle damage. These cards make up 60% of all monsters in the entire game capable of inherently summoning themselves from your main deck, and they also happen to be the best of the lot as well. I know that sounds awesome in that context, but that's only because the bar was set so incredibly low to begin with. The only reason why these 6 rank so high among them is that they're non-Nomi level 4s, meaning that they're rarely dead cards in your hand. That being said, all you get out of these are some above average beaters for level 4s that gain piercing damage if summoned via their inherent conditions, which put you into a hard minus to use. The exceptions to this are Dark and Lina, who, due to coming out much later than the other 4, have additional effects to search a card when they're summoned via their special conditions. Dark lets you search a level 3 or 4 light spellcaster, and Lina lets you search any spellcaster with 1500 defense when summoned by their conditions. If you summon either of these from the deck, they basically replace the cost of summoning them by letting you get a fairly generic search off their effects. While Dark technically has a wider pool of search targets, aside from Trick Clown, all the good ones can also be searched by Lina's effect as well. Lina, on the other hand, can search out not only just about any member of the archetype, but also several tech options like Asator Dawnwalker, Windwitch Icebell, Altergeist Silquidus, a couple of Dragma and Gravekeeper's monsters, and even Servant of Endymion. I hate myself for even suggesting such a card when it comes to talking about deck doctors, but there it is. Anyway, because of this, you'll want to make sure to run 2 or 3 Dark and Lina at all times, and run the other 4 by preference. Now, sharp-eyed viewers may have noticed that the familiars that are possessing the Charmers look a little different here, and that's because they've evolved to a new form. They are respectively Inari Fire, Ranryu, Gigabyte, and Nefarious Archfiend Eater of Nefariousness. I feel like Konami of America is really trying to take the piss on this one. Pray that we don't get another retrain after this, because otherwise it'll need to be printed on 2 cards just to get the name to fit. And no, this wasn't a localization thing, because again, it was just called Demon Eater in Japanese. This was a decision. Also, if you're wondering about retrained versions of Metabat and Happy Lover, I'm sorry to say that they don't exist. Yep, after defining a clear and distinct archetype theming, they just gave up on them until further notice. Hell, even Ranryu was a new addition to this lineup, only coming out in Rising Rampage, while the other 3 have been around for 7.5 years by now. But anyway, I digress. They're all level 4s with 1500 attack and 200 defense with various types, and you can only control one of each at any given time, but if you control a spellcaster, you can special summon them from the hand. This is where their individual effects come in. Inari lets you special summon itself from the graveyard during your next standby phase after it was destroyed face up on the field by a card effect. Ranryu lets you instantly special summon a monster from your graveyard with the same stat line except Ranryu. Gigabyte does the same thing except he summons from the deck instead and also misses timing for some reason. And if Nefarious Mouthful is in your graveyard during the opponent's end phase, you can target and destroy a monster you control to special summon this card. Much like the base forms of these cards, their main purpose is to act as extra bodies on board, but unlike their base forms, they're actually fairly competent in achieving this. The fact that they can instantly hit the board for free as long as you control a spellcaster means that they're almost never dead in your hand if the deck is doing what it's supposed to. But what really cements their place in the deck is their ability to function as somewhat of a cohesive engine. The fact that 3 of them can generate advantage off their destruction, while the 4th can act as a trigger for said destruction while maintaining advantage, on the opponent's end phase no less, is exceptionally helpful. Add that to the fact that none of these effects are a once per turn except for Inari, who is only a soft once per turn, and you've got yourself some impressive advantage generation abilities here. Granted, Inari is a bit slow, Ranryu requires setup, and Gigabyte, as mentioned before, can miss timing if you're not careful. But for the sheer amount of field presence you can create with these 4, I'd say it's worth the effort. Still though, the only one you need to max out on is Nefarious Mouthful, so run the others by preference. So now we move on to the next set in this jumbled mess of an archetype, commonly referred to as the Cataclysmic Charmers. They are Blazing Hita, Storming Wind, Raging Area, and Avalanching Asa. I don't know how an Earth Elemental could be considered avalanching, but you do you, KOA. Yes, I know landslides are a thing, but again, the Japanese version did it way better. Also, we once again skip over Dark and Lina's involvement with this series, but considering how these end up, I'm not too upset about their loss. They're all level 4 spellcasters with 800 attack and 1500 defense, and you contribute one other monster of the same attribute in order to special summon another monster of the same attribute from the hand. The monster summoned by this effect is destroyed if said Cataclysmic Charmer leaves the field. There are a few decent targets to consider, such as the upgraded familiars for one, but the main problem this series brings up is the one thing I was dreading the most with this archetype, which I had hoped Konami would certainly be better than: generic attribute support as the cost of archetypal synergy. Sure, you can cheat a monster out of your hand, but not only do you have to go -1 and put said monster on a leash in order to do so, but you have to have a monster of the correct attribute in your hand that you want to cheat out, and have another monster of the same attribute to tribute in order to fuel this effect. This makes the effect borderline useless outside of a deck dedicated to a singular attribute, let alone one that evenly uses all 6 like this one. Add that to the fact that these are non-archetypal monsters that gain no benefits from what little support the deck has, and you get a half-assed wave of mediocre cards that have little to nothing to do with the deck it was made for, and was a colossal waste of a good fan name like the Cataclysmic Charmers. Not nearly worth the effort. Speaking of cataclysmic monsters, we have another sub-series of monsters with little to do with the archetype, consisting of Cataclysmic Scorching Sunburner, Cryonic Coldo, Circumpolar Chilblania, and Crusted Calciphidia. The relation to the Charmer archetype is tangential at best and coincidental at worst, but for the sake of covering all bases, I will do my best to cover them. They're all level 8 fairies with 2600 attack and 200 defense, and they have a shared effect where they can special summon themselves from the hand if a monster of their respective attributes is destroyed by an opponent's card, at which point they also trigger their own unique effects. Sunburner burns the opponent equal to half the attack of one of those destroyed monsters in the graveyard. Coldo spins a spell trap on the field to the top of the deck. Chilblania sends a random card from the opponent's hand to the graveyard, and Calciphidia lets you mill any one monster from your deck. While the latter two have some pretty amazing effects, it should be noted that all 4 of these effects are based on other better effects that already existed in the archetype. Furthermore, this group also falls into the trap of generic attribute support above all else, though it's less egregious in this case as you only need 1 monster as opposed to 2 in order to use it, and it's a lot easier to use, meaning they're overall a lot more splashable. Plus, they didn't try to steal the archetype's aesthetic like the last set, so it didn't feel like they were ripping off their face and wearing it Hannibal Lecter style. Even still, I would only run by personal preference. Well, we're still not done with the retrains, as we have yet another bunch to go through. Hita the Fire Charmer Ablaze, Wind the Wind Charmer Verdant, Area the Water Charmer Gentle, and Asa the Earth Charmer Immovable are all linked to spellcasters with 1850 attack, perfect arrows, require 2 monsters of which 1 must be the same attribute at them, and they're always treated as familiar possessed monsters. You can target a monster in the opponent's graveyard with the same attribute attribute as them and special summon it to a zone they point to. And if these link summoned cards are destroyed by an opponent's card while its owner controls it, you can search out a monster of their respective attribute with 1500 or less defense from your deck. You can only use each effect of each charmer once per turn. Honestly, the worst thing I can say here is that they once again skipped over Dark and Lina. Even though I perfectly understand why, as this amount of generic attribute support that actually does play well with the deck it was intended for is absolutely ridiculous. The fact that they're treated as both Charmers and Familiar Possessed means that they benefit from both halves of the split support that the archetype received. They also have the ability to snatch a monster from the opponent's graveyard provided they have one of the same attribute. Plus a fantastic floating effect that lets you search out just about any monster of their attribute with 1500 or less defense, which includes literal hundreds, or even thousands in Asa's case, of targets per charmer. They even have a few great targets to search like Salaman Great Gazelle, Speedroid Terrortop, Dynamite the True Draco Fighter, and Dino Wrestler Pancratops, just to name a few. Granted, it's wholly dependent on the opponent to get it off, but the fact that it lets you search out so many cards outside of its archetype on a floating effect is definitely something to consider playing around with. One of each should suffice for a standard build, but depending on your ratios, you may want more than that if you tend to focus more on any particular attribute. The last monster in the archetype is yet another retrain in the form of Win the Wind Medium. She's a level 5 spellcaster with Familiar Possessed stats and is always treated as a Charmer monster. You can discard both this card and one Wind monster, add one Wind monster with 1500 or less defense from your deck to your hand except Win the Wind Medium. Also, for the rest of this turn, you cannot activate monster effects except the effect of Wind monsters. When a wind monster you control is destroyed by battle, you can special summon this card from your hand. You can only use each effect of Win the Wind Medium once per turn. I'm pretty sure that the only reason why they released Wind first instead of Hita like usual is because they were testing the waters for this level of generic attribute support by starting with the weakest of the four, similar to why they removed Tempest alone from the ban list earlier. In short, this card takes the generic attribute support problem I noted with the Cataclysmic Charmers and runs with it, and for all intents and purposes it ran it straight off a cliff and into a trash heap. It has the same search effect as Verdant, only now it's on an ignition effect as opposed to a trigger, which does make a load of a difference. However, it also requires extensive setup in your hand in order to pull it off, puts you into a hard minus to use, and most frustratingly locks you out of using non-wind effects for the rest of the turn, thereby all but ensuring you can only run it in a pure wind deck, i.e. not a charmer deck. Despite this, the card design team clearly wanted to have their cake and eat it too, because this card still treats itself as a charmer even though there's no way for a non-charmer deck to take advantage of this fact, as what little direct support the archetype has is solely limited to protection effects on strict archetypal back row cards. Furthermore, this card only treats itself as a charmer and not as a familiar possess, meaning that it receives the wrong side of said support that its stat line would warrant having. It can serve as a decent battle floater in a charmer deck, but not only is this only to serve as an extra body in a deck that already has a functional engine for this exact purpose, not only does Koldo serve this exact same purpose but better due to actually doing something while it summons itself, but also if the deck is functioning the way that the support wants it to, battle destruction is going to be hard to come by to begin with. Moreover, the fact that it's a level 5 means that it's both difficult to work with for extra deck plays considering the rest of the archetype, and also hard to bring to the field outside of its own summoning condition, rendering it as a band-aid fix for a losing situation at best and an unsalvageable brick at worst. Like I said, it's pretty good generic wind support, but as for an actual charmer deck, it's a textbook pot G if ever I saw one, and need I remind you, I've seen plenty of them by this point. Be sure to pass on this and the inevitable retrains for Hita, Area, and Asa as well. Now, you may have thought we were done with the mass review dumps now that the monsters are done, but we still have one more series to go through, the Spiritual Art Traps. Spiritual Fire Art Kurenai, Spiritual Wind Art Miyabi, Spiritual Water Art Aoi, Spiritual Earth Art Kurogane, Dark Spirit Art Greed, I'm sorry, what? And Spiritual Light Art Hijiri are all normal traps that require you to tribute a monster of their respective attributes to activate. Kurenai burns the opponent equal to the tributed monster's original attack. Miyabi spins a card on the opponent's field to the bottom of their deck. Aoi lets you look at the opponent's hand and discard a card of your choice. Kuragane lets you special summon a level 4 or lower earth monster from your graveyard other than the tributed monster. Greed lets you draw 2 cards but lets the opponent negate the effect by revealing a spell card in their hand. I'm sorry, what? And Hijiri lets you target and special summon any banished monster, but your opponent can negate this effect by revealing a trap card in their hand. I'm sorry, what? What is it with mediocre support cards that can give the opponent free reign to simply decide not to let you use your own effect? At the very least, Scrounging Goblin had a cost that discouraged the opponent from doing so. These two can't even boast that much, as all it requires the opponent to do is reveal a card in their hand, which they'll have no problem doing if they can. Furthermore, since they require you to tribute as cost in order to activate, it basically nets the opponent a free +2, so they'd be clinically insane not to negate it if they had the opportunity. Hijiri can get away with assuming the opponent has no trap cards in their hand since they're rarely run nowadays anyway, but the effect is incredibly underwhelming and requires either extensive setup or a favorable matchup in order to use effectively. Greed, on the other hand, can't even boast that much, as you can pretty much bet on the opponent always having a spell in their hand unless you're going up against Super Heavy Sams or something. The effect is pretty good, but since it's almost never going to go off, it's only really useful in layer decks where it can act as quick spot removal with the potential of letting you get a +2 if you're incredibly lucky. While we're on the subject though, can we also talk about how KOA royally fucked up the translation of this card? It's not like they didn't know this was a thing either, as the first 4 came out 2 years earlier and were named in a very similar fashion. Kurenai's Japanese name translates as Fire Spirit Art Crimson, for example, with Kurenai being Japanese word for crimson. If they followed the same naming conventions on the others, this one's English name should have been Spiritual Dark Art Yoku, but because they didn't, it was a bit of a leap to even connect this card to the others, even though that was clearly the intention. As for those first 4 though, you may have noticed that their effects are, for the most part, incredibly similar to their respective Cataclysmic monsters. Earth is a little off, but they both focus on interaction with the graveyard, so I'll let it slide. Interestingly, aside from that one example, the spiritual traps are a clear upgrade over the monsters due to dealing the full burn damage, spinning any card of your choice, and getting to look at the opponent's hand and choose what to discard respectively. However, since the traps require a specific tribute in order to activate, they can be tricky to use when needed without extensive setup. As it stands right now, I would say the best of the lot would have to be Aoi, with Miyabi as a close second, so feel free to run those 2 if you like, but as for the rest, I wouldn't bother for now. Now after, 43 cards now? We still have 2 more cards of actual support to go through, starting with the oldest of the 2, Unpossessed. It's a continuous trap with the following effect. Charmer monsters you control cannot be destroyed by battle. If a familiar possessed monster you control attacks an opponent's monster, it gains 800 attack during damage calculation only. If a monster you control is destroyed by battle or card effect, you can special summon one spellcaster type monster with 1500 defense from your deck, whose attribute is different from at least one of those destroyed monster's original attributes on the field, in attack position or face down defense position. You can only use this effect of Unpossessed once per turn. The battle protection to your Charmer monsters is downright crucial, considering it's what allows their effects, and by extension the deck, to even function. And the ability to turn your familiar possessed monsters into 2650 beaters is the closest thing the archetype has to a win condition outside of stealing an important boss monster, which hardly ever happens to begin with. Also, the fact that it can let you float into either of these if a monster you control does end up being destroyed means that you'll be able to recover should things go south, which they probably will be. The problem, as you might have suspected, is that this is an unsearchable continuous trap and therefore a bit too unreliable as a strategy. Unfortunately, however, this is also the only strategy they have, so they really can't afford not to max out on this one. The last card is the continuous spell card, Awakening of the Possessed. Monsters you control gain 300 attack for each different attribute you control. Charmer and familiar possessed monsters you control cannot be destroyed by card effects. If a spellcaster monster with 1850 original attack is normal or special summoned to your field, draw one card. You can only use this effect of Awakening of the Possessed once per turn. This basically serves as a simultaneously better and worse version of Unpossessed, but still combos extremely well with said card as well. It extends the attack boost and protection effects to both Charmers and Familiar Possessed, though the fact that the attack boost requires multiple attributes while they've been decidedly steering away from multiple attribute support makes me question the sanity of the design team. Also, the draw effect is exceptionally handy considering how easy it is to trigger, but unless you just so happen to draw into one of the traps, be it Unpossessed or one of the spiritual arts, that draw isn't going to help you much considering you almost certainly used up the normal summon by this point. Speaking of which though, if you do manage to combine this with Unpossessed, your Charmers will be completely immune to destruction, which is helpful, but the effect protection only applies while they're face up, meaning that they're still extremely vulnerable while they're face down, and your opponent is already going to know something is up with that face down anyway. It does, however, turn the Link monsters into actually formidable boss monsters, given how they'll be at least just under 3k while attacking, while completely immune to destruction, though by extension it does mean that their floating effects are now impossible to activate as long as they're both active. Still, like before, it's the only thing even closely resembling strategy, synergy, or support in this deck, so you still want to run 3 because it's still completely unsearchable. Here's an example of a pure Charmer deck utilizing all 6 attributes as effectively as reasonably possible, and here's a wind-centric version that uses medium and as much generic wind support as possible, even though this is still a far cry from what a Charmer deck is. So now we get to the diagnosis. First and foremost, the deck desperately needs more consistency, and when I say this, I don't mean draw power or search effects like I usually do, because they already have enough to be tolerable in that regard. I mean they need a way to be able to utilize their own cards and effects efficiently. As an extension to this, a way to consistently manipulate attributes is absolutely a must for this archetype. When the best tool you have for using your own effects is a crappy non-archetypal equip spell from 2003, you know it's time to reevaluate your game plan. A way to search out the spell traps is a must since the deck relies very heavily on their back row in order to function, since most of their monsters are effectively vanillas once they've hit the field. Likewise, they also need a way to utilize the spiritual art cards in a way that actually benefits their position. They have a very clear theming with the rest of the deck, so a way to actually use them would certainly help. And now we come to the prescription, this time sans outside input as Kieran is currently too busy working his ass off thanks to the quarantine, and I still don't have anybody else on the Discord who can help me with this shit either. I'm pretty busy myself, but I don't have the luxury of stopping for something as trite as a pandemic or a lack of funding. So with that in mind, let's get into the new support. First things first, I haven't done this since the Entities video, but we have an erratum to go through before the new support. Dark Spirit Art Greed has had its name changed to match with the naming conventions of the other 5. This was more than a cosmetic change, as there are a few effects in the new support which rely on it. Also, while I was at it, I updated the artwork to make it more visually fitting within the theme as well. This one was purely aesthetic, but I do have to admit it is a good aesthetic nonetheless. Now on to the actual new support. First up we have a continuation of the Evolved Familiars theme with Metamorph Bat and Joyous Paramour. They're a Dark Fiend and a Light Fairy respectively with the same level and stats as the others, and you can only control one of each, and you can special summon them from the hand if you control a spellcaster. Metamorph lets you destroy a monster in your hand or field with exactly 1500 attack or defense, and copy that monster's name, type, and attribute for the turn at a hard once per turn. And if Paramour is destroyed and sent to the graveyard, you can either special summon a Charmer or Familiar Possessed from your deck in attack or face down defense position, or set a Possessed spell trap or a Spiritual normal trap from your deck which can be activated this turn. These two expand on the Familiar engine quite nicely by raising both its consistency and its effectiveness. Metamorph functions as a much better trigger than Nefarious Mouthful, even with the hard once per turn on the effect. Not only does it allow you to destroy monsters in your hand as well as the field, in a way that doesn't even cause Gigabyte to miss timing, but the copy effect also has a lot of versatility behind it beyond just filler text. For one thing, it allows it to get around the only controlling one clause so long as you get rid of the extra one before the end phase, but also, since it also works on monsters with 1500 defense, it can copy the name of a charmer in your hand in order to fulfill the summoning conditions of their respective familiar possessed monster. Alternatively, it also copies the attribute of the destroyed monster, meaning it can also be used as the other side of the material for said summoning condition if you trigger the floating effects of another familiar. Speaking of which, Paramore has arguably the best floating effect among them, being able to not only special summon from the deck like Gigabyte without missing timing, but it also has the option to instead search out the back row cards in order to get to your win condition faster. Opening these two together allows you to immediately go into familiar possessed Lina on her own summoning condition to get her search effect by popping Paramore with Metamorph to copy her attribute and summon the Light Charmer from your deck. Alternatively, if you open these two alongside the Light Charmer, you can normal summon Lina in order to use Metamorph's special summon effect and search a back row card instead. Overall, a ton of versatility and power in these two that allows the deck to experiment with a lot of builds and engines that definitely warrants running 3 of each. Quick side note, I did do a lot of research and there are no other obnoxious floaters in the game with exactly 1500 attack or defense that would be broken with Metamorph Bat's effect. Most of the ones that can be used with this effect need to be destroyed on the field or don't care how they're sent to the graveyard and therefore have much better options to utilize them with. Even looking at other Deck Doctors cards, the only other one that receives any benefit from this card is Hunter Guardian, and that's just due to it having a graveyard effect. Also, I didn't bother making Dark and Lina versions of the Cataclysmic or Link series because A, they wouldn't add much to their playstyle, B, adding effects to make them good is more trouble than they're worth, and C, in the case of the latter series, it's probably going to happen eventually anyway. Moving on to the actual last monster, we have a brand new charmer, Teresa the Omni Charmer. She's a rank 4 light spellcaster Xyz with familiar possessed stats, requires 2 or more level 4s in material, and is always treated as a familiar possessed monster. This card's attribute is also treated by each of its attached materials attributes, unaffected by the effects of your opponent's monsters with the same attribute as this card. You can detach 1 Xyz material from this card, take control of 1 monster your opponent controls with the same attribute as this card. You can only use this effect of Teresa the Omni Charmer once per turn. Once per turn during the end phase, you can attach 1 monster from your opponent's graveyard to this card as Xyz material. As far as boss monsters for this deck goes, it doesn't get much better than this. It treats itself as both a charmer and a familiar possessed, meaning that it gets the full benefits from the support. It treats itself as multiple attributes at once, depending on the materials it used, and it can also add materials under it from the opponent's graveyard, meaning that it'll almost always have a matching attribute to use its snatch effect. It also has built-in protection against your opponent's monster effects, so long as they're of a matching attribute to this card. Since this one is always a light by default, it also has full immunity to cards like Ghost Ogre and Effect Veiler, who would otherwise be rather problematic hand traps to deal with. There's also the fact that the snatch is permanent, has no restrictions, and doesn't target, meaning that it's a lot easier and more powerful than the basic control effects of the level 3 charmers. It does require you to detach its cost, which will require you to be careful with losing an attribute you need to steal with, but that can be worked around well enough to not be too problematic. Run 2. Their first new spell card is Gathering of the Possessed. Shuffle any number of familiar possessed monsters from your hand into the deck. Draw cards equal to the number of monsters shuffled into the deck by this effect, +1. During either player's main phase, you can banish this card from the graveyard, change 1 face-down defense position charmer monster you control to face-up defense position. You can only use each effect of Gathering of the Possessed once per turn. More of a utility spell than anything. It gives you a mulligan for your opening hand by shuffling your familiar possessed back into the deck, since while they're not the worst garnets in the world, they're still effectively garnets nonetheless. However, the real meat of the effect has to be the graveyard effect, which allows you to instantly trigger the flip effects of the charmers in order to steal a monster at your leisure. It also works on either player's turn, meaning that it can be used regardless of whether you go first or second. This is provided that you can effectively use the charmer's effects, but we'll get to that in a minute. Overall, it's a helpful tool to have, so 2 or 3 should suffice. Their other spell card is their new field, Library of the Possessed. When this card is activated, you can add 1 possessed spell trap from your deck to your hand, except Library of the Possessed. You can only use this effect of Library of the Possessed once per turn. Your opponent cannot target face-down defense position monsters you control with card effects. During either player's turn when a monster is summoned, you can declare 1 attribute, change the attribute of those monsters to the declared attribute. The search effect on activation is helpful in that it can help you set up your win conditions faster. The protection effect for your face downs can let your charmers use their flip effects a lot easier, especially if you search unpossessed with the first effect. However, that all pales in comparison to the attribute manipulation effect, which all but guarantees that said flip effects will be live at any given moment. It's not a once per turn, and it also doesn't target, meaning they can get around targeting protection as well. Since the charmer's effects target, though, that isn't as helpful, but it can be used to match an opponent's boss monster with Teresa so that she's protected from its effects, and can even steal said monster with her own effect. It also has the advantage of screwing with decks that rely on a particular attribute in order to hinder their plays, though that doesn't come into play quite as often. Since this deck lives or dies by this card more than any other, make sure to run 3 at all times. The last card is the Continuous Trap Dispossessed. While you control a familiar possessed monster, you contribute monsters your opponent controls to activate spiritual normal trap cards. If a possessed card you control would be destroyed by an opponent's card, you can banish 1 monster from your graveyard instead, but you cannot banish monsters with that monster's attribute to use this effect again this turn. You can discard 1 card, add 1 spiritual normal trap from your deck or graveyard to your hand. You can only use this effect of Dispossessed once per turn. Assessing the issue of these spiritual traps was fairly easy since I kinda hit the nail on the head in the review when I mentioned Layer of Darkness. Tributing the opponent's monsters to activate them allows you to go +1 off of almost all of them, the exceptions being Kurenai and Yoku and sometimes Hijiri. But even in those cases, it's still an even 0 in the worst of situations since it gets rid of a problem monster as cost. And since it also has the ability to search and recycle them, it allows you to save on deck space by only running 1 of each. While I'm on the subject, I want to address the way I handled the archetype definition, since while it works now, it might not in the future if Konami fucks me over like it is wont to do. Since the series was localized as spiritual blank art, I couldn't define it as such with that variable in the middle, so I was left with just spiritual to work with, but that runs into another problem with other cards with spiritual in the name, not the least of which being the Ritual Beast archetype, which uses the word fairly commonly in their sub-archetype. However, I was able to get by on a loophole as none of these other cards were normal traps, since the only other one that was a trap was a continuous from the Bonds Beyond Time movie pack. So long as KOA doesn't make another spiritual normal trap that has nothing to do with the series, it should be fine. Special announcement. During the time between editing and getting this video ready for release, Konami apparently found a new way to screw me over by releasing new support for this archetype in the form of the Masters of the Spiritual Art Structure deck. This includes a brand new field spell which also happens to fall under the Spiritual Art series, meaning that my archetype definition is no longer applicable. Since editing for this video is already queued up, I won't be reviewing this card just yet, since this is so far the only new card from this deck that we know of, but this means that Charmers will most certainly be featured in the next episode of Doctor's Notes and may need to be completely overhauled after this wave of support, since it's too late in the series for me to drop this one too. Konami, it looks like you finally decided to screw me over so completely this time. Oh, and also this card protects your other back row cards, including itself, as well as your familiar possessed monsters, but that latter one only matters for battle protection as long as Awakening is on the field. Protection can only be used up to 6 times per turn, or 7 if you happen to be using Divine, but that should be enough to keep you in the game. 2 or 3 should be fine. And that's all I got. With the number of control effects in this archetype, designing support is risky, but with as back row heavy as it should be fine in the current meta. As I mentioned before, Charmers have been a fan favorite for many for years after their release, so it is kind of bizarre that their archetypal support has been so contradictory for so long. On a side note, but digressing slightly, I do have to admit it is sort of refreshing to see an archetype I review with so much fan art since Karivos after 4 episodes of scrounging for what little images I can find. Regardless, as sure as the sun will set, there's bound to be more Charmer support coming in the future, so let's hope that at least some of it will be something that actually supports the playstyle that the archetype needs. Thank you guys so much for watching. Kinda hard to believe, but the next episode will be the finale. I still can't believe I made it this far, and if this series hadn't gotten to the level of popularity it had when it did, I definitely wouldn't have. Now, if I can only get some actual income from this, I can produce some consistent content for once. Anyway, for now, thank you for watching, and until next time, don't get run over, and I'll see you guys later.